Hey, Jacob.
Good to have you on
Thank you.
SenseSpace. It's been a while coming, I think. I wouldn't say we go way back yet, but we definitely go a little way back. Um, you are
Yeah.
half of Rebel Wisdom. That's fair to say. I don't want to divide up the wisdom,
Mhm.
but one half of Rebel Wisdom. You're a very interesting guy, a very strange guy. You have many fields of expertise and talent. You've done meditation teaching, novels, podcasts. Um, you lead some very, very powerful men's retreats. So it's just, yeah, really great to get you on. You're one of the people that I kind of had in mind, like start a podcast, gonna have conversations with people like Ali. Um, so yeah, awesome.
Nice. Thanks, man. Yeah, it's good to be here. It's good to have. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to see where a conversation flows. We've had conversations in the past, various different settings, but never like this. So yeah, it's cool.
Yes, usually at the bar or at the post drinks or something in the
Mm,
smoking area. But sometimes that's where the best conversations percolate up. So hopefully we can bring some of that into the internet. Um, well, I guess we'll just start with your pieces because I've kind of noticed you. I mean, we met like 2 years ago when you were doing the videos. You do a lot with events, did the big Rebel Wisdom Summit last year, which was insane. But really, in the last sort of 6 months, you've been pioneering something which I feel like is probably a new step for you, which has been writing these really cutting edge doesn't really do it justice, but these really kind of there's something very novel about these Medium articles that you've been putting out. And the fact that I'm so baffled as to how to characterize it probably speaks to that. But they're really about kind of making sense of where we are right now, and not in a drab psychoanalytical sense-making way, but in a very kind of poetic, mythic, kind of calling forth, hearkening, slightly insightful way. In particular, I'm talking about the piece you did called The Lost Ways of Knowing. And you had one before that and one after that in a kind of series, the names of which I've forgotten. But wow, tell me a little bit about like how you felt about writing these things and where the hell they come from.
yeah. Well, thanks for the kind words about them. And I'm glad they landed like with you. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it was kind of a big thing for me personally to write the first one, which was called A Story to Bind Us, which was about kind of looking at pop culture and tying it to, um, yeah, looking at our current cultural and situation and the meaning crisis through the lens of the sort of hidden code of popular culture. So looking at lots of different TV shows, looking at the Gnostic Gospels, looking at the Matrix, looking at a lot of different sources. And like my background is, well, my degree in university was English literature, and my kind of focus for most of my life, as in from the age of like 17. So like from the age of like 17 to 29 or so, I was writing novels and trying to get novels published. And when I self-published when I was in university, and then I was like, after that, I was like, okay, I just want to, like, all I want to do is write novels. And actually, I got myself into a really uh, difficult space with that, like, because it was so tied to my identity, and it became such an attachment. I became so anxious about it. I like I did like a novel development course at a literary agency, and like it was, yeah, it was a good process. It was like 12 of us working on our novels for like deeply for 6 months. But after that process, like it just kind of drove me a little bit. I don't want to say it drove me mad. It's not really true. It was more that it was so difficult for me because I was in this position where I was sort of writing with an expectation of something, like, oh, I need to write in order to do this, and it just kind of sucked all the magic out of it for me. And then I just had to do this really difficult. I had to go through this very difficult process where I had to stop writing, um, and stop identifying myself as a novelist. And actually, I remember this moment of like wrestling with myself, and I was like, fuck, like what am I gonna do if I'm not doing that? Like it was like such an existential dread. I was like, what, like who am I if I'm not doing that? And then I remember this, like coming to this sort of arrangement with myself where I was like, okay, I'll be a polymath. I'll just do loads of different things. Because I do loads of different things. That'll be my identity. And it was sort of okay. It was like a plaster until about really just like maybe the last 6 months or so, where slowly I've started writing again. It was actually painful for me to write. Like it just reminded me of like this deep sense of failure. Like, oh, I dedicated my entire adult life to getting a novel published, and then I choked because it was too difficult. And like that was my narrative, which was actually like super harsh and not really true in the sense, like in retrospect. But I think I had to go through that process, and it was a huge process for me. So when it came to writing that first article, I just really wanted to write. I wanted to write again, but I also like just had this like real feeling that part of what was missing in the conversation that we've been covering on Rebel Wisdom and the people we've been interviewing is not totally missing, because there's people like Akira, Dawn, and Jordan Hall who are really great at talking about pop culture, but it's not as like present as a lot of other things. So I wanted to get that lens in there, and it was also a chance to sort of introduce this new group of thinkers who we've been covering, people like John Vervaeke, and Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger, and sort of explore where they were different to the people we've been covering before, who've been the intellectual dark web, who had maybe less of a spiritual or psycho-spiritual lens on things, who were a little bit more cultural and political. And so then Lost Ways of Knowing, the next one, which is actually meant to be a 3-part series, but the pandemic has put a pause on parts 2 and 3. And in a way, I jumped straight to part 3 in the third piece I wrote. But Lost Ways of Knowing was about... and another thing, I mean, they kind of come from a place of curiosity or a feeling of like, oh, there's something missing, which I think is true of a lot of the stuff we put out in Rebel Wisdom. It's generally a feeling of like what's not being said or what's not being explored or what wants to come out. And then it's a fairly intuitive process, I think, for both of us. And so that for me, I was like, okay, I had a feeling that we were only... again, there was a bias towards selecting for certain types of knowing, certain ways of seeing the world, and ignoring other ways of seeing the world. And some of the people we're talking to, and just the wider, I suppose, community around systems change and cultural change. So that article was exploring that, or starting the exploration of that. And then the third one, which came out not so long ago, like 2 weeks ago, is called Traversing the Underworld. And it's about what myth and what a mythic frame can teach us about the pandemic. And that one is the one I'm actually most proud of. And that's actually my favorite one. Because that framing is just something I feel very connected to, and the importance of myth. And I think the people I spoke to were just so interesting, all of them. So but it's interesting because I've been trying to feel into, like, for ages I've thought, like, what's the next, not that there'll just be one, but what are some of the next formats of writing that might come? Because the novel is called novel because it was novel, in the early late 1800s. or early 19. It's not that old. It's like early 1900s when it was getting popularity. Like it was a new way of telling stories and reading. It's a genre with its own patterns and tropes, its own sort of like morphic resonance. It has its own. It's incredibly varied what you can do in a novel, but it's also it's a genre I'm not sure that, at least certainly right now, I want to explore. Not least because the publishing industry has changed so fundamentally that, like, most first novels, if they're lucky, sell 1,000 copies. And of those 1,000 copies, I don't know how many actually get read cover to cover, but I'm going to guess generously half or 40%. So you can write an article on Medium that gets that many people in the first few hours and is like much less of, there are far fewer middlemen. Not that editors aren't important, they are. Like, editors are really, like, I kind of would, like, I value a lot getting like editorial feedback from people. But the whole industry, the whole publishing industry, I found it really pissed me off. It really pissed me off, actually, because it was so sort of rigidly structured and kind of like old-fashioned. It's like super old-fashioned. You got to find an agent, and then once you have an agent, they on your behalf kind of sell to a publisher who they sort of all know each other, and they all like, it's super subjective, which is just like drove me insane. I was like, yeah, but what are they looking for? They're like, I don't know. We know when we see it. It's like, and there's some truth to it as well. Like, I get it. It is true. Like, that is what curation is. You just sort of know it when you see it. But I found it very stressful, and I just, So the form of those pieces, I think, owes a lot to, like, in style, to Peter Kingsley is one influence, who's a classical scholar and has written some beautiful books about the pre-Socratic philosophers, Parmenides and Empedocles, and also recently a book about Jung, a biography of Jung called Catafalque, which is an astonishing book. But what kind of blew my mind reading his work, maybe like, I don't know when I first read it, maybe 5, 6, no longer, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, is that he writes nonfiction like poetry, and it's crazy. I remember like reading Reality, which is one of his books, and being like, this is the weirdest book I've ever read. Like, this is so strange. And like, it's like he's really a mystic, but a scholar as well. And I just completely get sucked into that. And that really stuck with me. And I was like, oh shit, that isn't, like, I want to do something like that. I want to do like something that's not fiction and it's not nonfiction. That's kind of, I'm kind of only verbalizing it as I'm talking about it now, really. Like, I don't really, it's kind of been in the back of my mind, but like, I want to do something that's both. Yeah.
I feel like, wow. I mean, just as you're kind of telling me that, I feel like I'm going from, I could perceive sort of a glimmer of literary alley as that part of yourself when I first met you. And I just was like, wow, who's this really like strange, interesting guy who says wise things to me from time to time. And now it's like 90%. So it's clearly like you're bringing more of yourself and like some of that foundation into what you're doing now. If it's okay with you, I'd love to read a little bit from one of the pieces just to get a flavor for the style of it.
I'd be honored. That's really cool. Yeah.
Okay. So this is from your, this is a couple of bits from your Lost Ways of Knowing Medium article, read in my voice, not yours, unfortunately. We can reconnect to lost ways of knowing. And to do that, we have to do the thing that seems mad. We have to close our eyes, to listen to the sounds around us, to shiver as the mist touches our skin and we feel within it the hint of a clearing ahead. We can make ourselves achingly vulnerable to uncertainty. We can let go for a moment of everything we think we know and everything that has made us feel safe. And just continuing a little further down the piece. This is not a series about what we need to do to get out of the woods. It's a series asking, how do we need to start perceiving in order to see the woods for what they are? In what new ways can we take in, interpret, and act on information in an age where information itself has been weaponized? Above all, what kind of people do we need to become to meet the challenges faced by our species?
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. Really love
Thank
that. And I sent you an email at the time of, I'm just getting a pop-up. I sent you an email at the time of my reading that because, I mean, for me, I kind of discovered this wisdom communities and like emerging discourses and self-development and all of this stuff concurrent to hitting the most difficult track point in my own life. So it was like really like a necessary rather than just like a kind of, oh, this feels interesting. It was like, it feels interesting and it's exactly what I need in the moment right now. And so for people who are kind of getting thrown into the confusion of the present moment, which we can, I think, fairly assume is many. The people who are getting thrown into tragedy of existence is evidenced all around us. And I certainly was wrestling with that myself when I read this piece. And so just to read those passages about coming into the like intuitive sense and embracing vulnerability, it's a remarkably powerful thing. It feels like you've tuned into kind of meaning pirate radio and you've found the signal out there and all of the noise that's speaking to you in the present moment, and it just kind of stacks and aligns. And there's a music and a poetry to that. And so much of what I've seen going on with dialogos and sense making and different kind of communities cross-pollinating is intellectuals becoming more artistic and intuitive, and artists and intuitive people becoming more intellectual and meeting in the middle. And a beautiful kind of new thing, which for me, I'm like a 60s counterculture geek. So for me, it's kind of like the new kind of Allen Ginsberg talking to the Deadheads and the Hell's Angels and all of these different wild groups coming together in a very intense moment. But just sort of bringing it back to what you were saying about your story, I really got a sense of like, when you have like a dream and a track that you identify with, and then it crashes, or it doesn't prove to be the thing, like you go down the track that you're supposed to go down. I had this experience in academia for myself. Like you go where you're supposed to go, you're doing the thing you're most passionate about, and then you just hit these walls and you're thrown out into the dark, cold forest. You don't know which way to go in, and possibly you're also confronting tragedy at the same time. And so, yeah, I guess the two threads I'm really trying to pull out here is what's the relationship between that coming into vulnerability with the world and kind of conversely experiencing vulnerability in the world, and developing an intuitive sense. And what you were saying with David and Rebel Wisdom about sort of looking for the thing that's missing. I mean, you said it in a kind of, blasé way almost, but at the depth of it, that's almost like, that goes down to like the weird kind of mysterious Taoist, like really kind of deep psychedelic spiritual ways of perceiving, where you're like noticing the things between things and that kind of thing. So what does all that throw up for you?
It's good. It's good stuff. I just want to like comment on your point about the intellectuals and artists intellectuals and linking that to the 60s. I think that's really cool. I hadn't really thought about that. I hope that is happening, you know, like that's why I feel like it's part of what needs to happen. But yeah, so yeah, so I think there's some common threads to everything you just said for me, which is like there's something around like openness and sensitivity to, I guess, what we would in our workshops call like the field, you know, like the kind of field of awareness that we as human beings, when we're in a group, or you could argue maybe when you tap into a wider collective field, kind of what similar to what Jung called the collective unconscious. It's like there is a feel to it. It's a zeitgeist. It's a zeitgeist. Like what is that's what artists do. Like that's the job of the artist. And in fact, it's kind of the job of the elder as well, as Stephen Jenkinson said in the third article in Traversing the Underworld. It's like to basically, as he puts it, like bear faithful witness to the times, like what is present in the times, and to speak the truth of it regardless, you know. That is the job of the artist. It's like the job of the artist isn't actually to create art, it's to let art speak through them. And of course they are in a co-creative process with that. Their own unique perspective and ego is shaping it as well. It's not that it's just like pure channeling. I think that's not ever the case. But there is certainly some element to that. And I think to what we're trying to do at Rebel Wisdom, where it's more like, where does the conversation want to go, or where does, like, what is kind of coming out of the culture, what's coming out of the collective as best as we can understand it. And then I guess the point around vulnerability is that requires a certain at least a curiosity and an openness and a not knowing, and that not knowing is a vulnerable place to be in, even though ironically I think it's a safer place to be in, you know. Like there's this great example of and whether or not it actually happened, I don't know, but Alan Watts talks about how the Zen monks would train samurai, and one of the ways is like so can you imagine, as a samurai, you're standing like in the middle of a dark field and you're surrounded by enemies. You have to be like a barrel of water, because the barrel of water, if it gets pierced at any point, the water flows out without hesitation immediately. And the water isn't trying to do anything, it's just being water. So the samurai, if he's standing there thinking, like, and trying to control, like, where is it? Is it to the left? Is it the right? Someone behind me? That split second of hesitation is going to get him killed. But the water never hesitates. And actually, because Zen is in some ways a mix of Buddhism and Taoism, it's fitting, because Taoism is called the watercourse way sometimes, and the central image to understand Taoism is water, because water is forever flowing, and also it always finds the point of least resistance, and it's both very innocuous and incredibly powerful, you know. So it's a great metaphor. Yeah, and so there's something about the difference between rigidity and flow. But in Taoism, you need both. You know, it's not just one or the other. You can't just be in a state of constant vulnerability and flow with the world, because you're going to get swept away by the world. Like, you have to also learn how to, in my view and in my experience, you have to learn how to, and I'm not very good at this, by the way. Just as a caveat, you have to learn how to close up in a healthy way, protect, but also not let that like ossify and solidify into a kind of closed off rigidity, and then like opening out into like a flexible, sensitive openness. Like, I veer much more, because of just like personality and personal history, to like, I'd rather feel the safety of closing up and be less sensitive, but know that I'm safe and know that I've got my shit together and I know what's coming where. And I can be stuck in there. So my task is to loosen up, and be into the flow. And when I'm in that space, that's like my creative space. And weirdly, like when I'm creative, it helps me stay in that space as well. But I have yeah, I think both of those things are more difficult for different people. And I have friends who are artists, and I feel like they just need to like ground and put some boundaries in place and close up a little bit because they're too open, and you get it in the psychedelic world a lot, that people sort of blow open into like deep receptivity, and then they're like going through the world, walking through a city, loads of stimulus, loads of intentions coming their way, etc., and they don't have any kind of protection around it, and you get eaten alive, so there's a fine balance in the middle somewhere of being able to dance between those two ways of being. And I think that's like a serious art that like definitely one that I would really like to get really skilled at, because I think it probably just comes with practice like anything else, but it's hard because both like opening up is pretty, like opening up is dangerous in some way because you might get hurt for sure. Closing up is dangerous in some way because you risk disconnecting from the world and from people, and you risk cutting yourself off into this lonely, empty space. So they're both like necessary and dangerous in some way. They have their own dangers with them. So it's like, I guess it's like dancing, but in a room that's on fire. It's maybe like too harsh of a metaphor, but it's something like that. Or like dancing on hot coals in a way. Like if you stay still for too long, that's a better metaphor. The house is just like, you're just gonna die, right? There's just gonna be no oxygen in there. It's more like a really beautiful dance on hot coals.
I'm feeling so
and
many,
if you stay still for too long.
So many adages and metaphors and different things coming up. The whole thing of like the shaman kind of swims in the same waters that the psychotic drowns in. And oh my God, there's so many. I'm feeling a number of forks coming up in different directions, just as you're saying that. For one thing, just kind of, I mean, this is kind of an aside which I'm looking to explore more as the SenseSpace develops, but as you're talking about be like water, that's just bringing up for me the Hong Kong Revolution of Our Times movement, and they're kind of drawing on this thing from Bruce Lee about be like water and kind of their battle with the state like that. So it's a kind of interesting like mapping from the literal physical reality of these young activists with their umbrellas, like moving around the city and rolling back and forth and communicating. And then this kind of linguistic, philosophical layer. And then just to posit something altogether different, which is coming up for me as well, is this issue of kind of how to balance out the vulnerability. Because it's something that you and David have posted things about quite a bit. And it's kind of this matter of like spiritual communities having a real vulnerability to, or relationship with like narcissistic personalities. And there's a real complexity to this, which needs to be unraveled, because there's a kind of relationship between trauma and existential openings, spiritual openings, and also narcissistic personalities. And it's like very often that wounding that people have that's initially opening up them to perceive all that they can perceive is also kind of bringing with it all of this dangerous hidden aspects. And so you guys have been very kind of, at least David, I know, has posted a number of times kind of things sort of flagging up this danger. And I think it is a real it
Yeah,
may well be one
it
of
really
the,
is.
might be the most important challenge. Certainly, I feel it's one of the most important challenges of spiritual communities. And even going back sort of like, I mean, my dad was a minister in kind of loose kind of 90s, 2000s Christian communities, but very similar kind of issues going on then, where you have these kinds of charismatic or narcissistic individuals getting involved. And especially with Christianity, what you have is, in some contexts, a container which is kind of capturing lots of vulnerable people and bringing them all together and just plonking them into a community context where there's a lot of love and clapping and singing songs. But then there's a lot of hidden material.
Yes.
And so the thing that is kind of not necessarily obvious when people see Rebel Wisdom and see the sense making and stuff is that you guys kind of have an ear on the ground for these kinds of like, how do you bring that real learned kind of caution when it comes to these spiritual communities and building new communities and all of that?
Yeah, it is like the key question, and will become an even bigger question after the pandemic and during it, because I think we're going to see more vulnerable people being sucked into charismatic spirituality that's disenfranchising them than we have before, would be my guess. I don't know if you've ever seen the show The Leftovers or the book or aware of it, but I highly recommend it. It was on HBO a few years ago, but like the premise of it is that like 2% of the world's population vanish into thin air one day, and then it takes place like 3 years later, and it kind of follows a sheriff of a town and like his family and a bunch of other characters, and like the whole show is about grief. Like it's great because the makers of the show, it's Damon Lindelof, who did Lost. He was like, you're never going to find out. From the beginning of the show, he was like, you don't find out what happened to the people. It's like, so just like forget about it, because that's not what the show's about. It's not like a mystery show where you're trying to figure it out. It's about how people respond to it and like getting back to normal, but this like deep wound inside everybody, and some people more than others, like depending how many people they lost or whatever. And like loads of cults spring up and loads of charismatic leaders spring up, and like that's like a main theme of the show. It's brilliant show. I'm rewatching it now actually. I think you'd love it actually, Jacob. I think you would love that show. It's
You'll link me to it after we finish up.
Yeah, I'll send you a link. But anyway, I mean, like that's been like a burning question. I think like I've certainly seen it in the psychedelic world, and it's painful to watch. It's painful to watch because it is so harmful. It's so harmful for that kind of spiritual narcissism to creep in. And I think it's like actually Carl Jung warned about it and was really had a deep understanding of this and why it happens, and how people confuse themselves with the archetype, confuse their egos with the archetype, and why that leads to inflation, and that inflation is what you're talking about, and like basically what we're talking about here is that kind of deeply ego-driven but pretending not to be. And it genuinely seems to be that there's some people who are just conning people, but I think there's more, at least in the psychedelic world, it's more the case that they genuinely believe that they are special, and that they have special vision, etc., which is far more dangerous in some ways, you know.
With the further layer, they may actually have special vision.
Of course,
They may well be incredibly visionary as well.
That's the point. That's of course what makes it work. If they were just like super uncharismatic, not tapped in any way to anything, people would just be like, nah, because you can feel it off someone, right? You can feel a certain energy of someone. So like that's a really good point. Like that's one of the things that makes it so confusing. And the thing is, not everyone who's tapped into that is bad news either. They're human. Everyone is human, so everyone has their flaws. But some people are, on the whole, bringing something very heartfelt and loving to the world from that space. So there's that complexity too, and they're like, nothing is black and white either. But I guess the issue is, so many communities in particular seem like, specifically spiritual communities, go tits up. Like so many of them. Christianity is actually pretty solid. I mean, the grand scheme of things, like, even though there's obviously huge issues as well, like it's lasted, and there's obviously not just one Christian community. There's thousands, if not tens, surely tens of thousands, right? And I'm sure some are much worse and some are much better than others. But I guess the interesting thing, and something that Jamie Wheel has talked about on the channel a lot, is like, how do you create ethical cults, and how do you prevent communities from falling into these dynamics, which are like almost like waiting to happen, so, and that is an ongoing inquiry. This is like an ongoing question. I have no idea. I have some feeling of what not to do, and actually Jamie has made an ethical cult checklist, which is pretty good. But at the same time, it's like, it feels very important that we come together in what he calls communitas, right? Like really coming together in a deeply connected way with each other feels essential. It is essential. It's an essential part of being human and finding meaning and connecting to something greater than ourselves, and greater than the community, etc. So how to do that in like a 2.0 version.
As you're saying that, for whatever reason, I'm just being thrown back to the retreat last year, and you sort of standing by the fire and speaking these kind of powerful, poetic words, and I just want to like bring out for people that it's not just theoretical. Like, you've gone quite far into how to bring this into practice, and obviously it has to be a kind of playful thing in a way. Like, you can't take yourself as seriously as you can't be like a Catholic priest in the gown handling the bread, but it's like a serious play almost. Like there's like, it's like you're creating the thing, and you're creating these journeys and experiences and linguistic frames for people, but it's always kind of being held lightly. It's always with a self-awareness that you are creating it as you're doing it. And I wonder if that's kind of that is really important. That's a literary philosophy almost, isn't it? It's like as you get, I mean, I was a complete like novice at this, but I was very close with someone who was a kind of literary philosophy, really devoted to that. And so I learned a lot from them. But this way in which you can kind of read life almost into the way of novels, and kind of the way like temporality and the self-awareness, and like the, what do you call it, the untrustworthy narrator, and all of these things. There's these ways in which, when you get that kind of deep understanding of literature and a kind of philosophical understanding of it, that kind of carries out into everything. I think that's beautifully said. Like, and I hadn't really thought of that, but I guess that's really in my DNA, and is sort of a big part of how I see the world. It's like seeing the world as a story and art seems quite natural to me. Like, or it seems Irish
like
blood.
the way Who?
You have Irish blood?
I do. I'm half Irish. Yeah. That's it. It's a big part of the culture, actually. Yeah, and but I mean, on that point as well, I mean, I think like there's things that you get in the institutional kind of make people feel better or more developed, i.e. psychology, the psychology institution, which are very, very important, that you don't get in a lot of the spiritual communities, that help to mitigate people taking it too seriously and taking themselves too seriously. For example, they have supervision. So they have a more experienced therapist who's checking in with them constantly, discussing different cases, etc. And we're really lucky at Rebel Wisdom because we have Rafia, our friend and mentor, who's been doing kind of therapeutic and just inner growth work for like 40 years. And like that has been essential because, you know, like talking about, you know, when you do a workshop, people project lots onto you. We all do it. Like if I see someone get up on a stage for 5 minutes and to do something really great with a guitar, I'm like, wah! I'm just you know, like women are like 10 times more attractive when they're doing it. Like, you know, that men are like, I really admire them. I don't know them. They could be the biggest fucking asshole in the world. They could be such a psychopath. So like, you don't actually like that. That's a thing. Something Rafi told us was like, that's a really useful way to deal with projection in a group setting, is to be like, no one here really knows me, you know, like in the space. I've met them like 2 days ago and they see one side of me that's specifically designed to create a container, you know, and it is authentic, but there's also like, it's weird. It's like an authentic, and it doesn't work if it's not true and embodied and authentic, but it's also sort of like partial, and there's a trickster quality to it as well, you know? So there's like real complexity to that. I also genuinely, I think it's much easier doing men's work because I think the projection from women, or from like, I mean, whatever your sexuality is, the projection from whoever you find sexually attractive and want to be seen as sexually attracted by, that's going to throw up a whole lot of stuff, right? So I often have thought, I'm like, I feel like this whole thing would be more difficult if it was mixed groups. And I haven't really done very much with mixed groups. You know, I've done a bits and pieces, but like going into a really new space with mixed groups, like I've done loads of participating in it, but actually holding space and doing that, I'm like, I could see where it would all get a little bit trickier, you know, just energetically, and having to work with that and be like, oh, they think I'm so great. Oh, man, no. It's like you'd have to like shut that down and really work through it. And ideally have reflection and have accountability from your peers, right? That's what we're missing. And this is like the whole thing we're exploring on the channel right now. It's like, we're in a liminal world and a world between worlds. And then David has referred to it in the media space as like an interregnum between like the old gatekeepers of knowledge and where we're at now, which is like the Wild West, where anyone can say anything. And it's like, we don't know what it looks like to start like regulating ourselves. Like, how do you start regulating that, right? And it's the same in a lot of like the psychedelic retreats that are happening. It's a piece I've just started working on now is that in the psychedelic world, like, how do we regulate it? How do we regulate ourselves? How do we have a sheriff that doesn't become a oppressive sheriff? Like, how do you decentralize it? Do you do this? Like, it's a big, big problem because a lot of big money is coming into the space, and that automatically creates a problem. So like, these are all questions happening in so many different industries right now, you know?
It definitely, the kind of trajectory and the question of psychedelics and the ethics around them and community around them feels like that's almost just like so many of the questions of community building as a whole are encapsulated in the getting right of that issue. And
it's tricky. No one knows how to do it yet. Is the thing. Like,
well, yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. We have a kind of landscape now of like, there's still a very widespread taboo on the discussion of psychedelics in the culture right now. Like, as it stands, and certainly in my personal experience for many, many years now, even though from my own experience, they've been completely transformative, completely integral to me discovering more about who I am. And like, I mean, even the notion that I could produce art or draw as like a very kind of previously heady intellectually oriented person was completely outside the realms of possibility. The notion of going from being completely emotionally stricken into like a Spock-like stance towards other people to becoming very deeply intuitive. All of those things are so wrapped up for me with these utterly confounding, mysterious experiences. But then we have this very mature attempt by Robin Carhart Harris, and there's a whole host and array of figures who are really leading this effort. Michael Pollan, everybody's doing this really important work of, okay, we're going to bring it in through the medical lens, we're going to bring it through a therapeutic lens. I know your wife's directly involved in this, so that's all super important, but I still feel like there's not enough people actually talking about the mystery of it itself. And that's partly like where in my own kind of academic track, what I found is that the complexity of the question that I wanted to ask about Islam and its relationship to politics and violence was it couldn't be held in the existing structures. So I looked to these emerging structures and the intellectual dark web and so forth as where that might come from. And likewise with psychedelics, it's like we don't actually have the conversation container. I'm seeing glimpses of it in the last 6 months, kind of popping up with you guys, particularly with the dialogos between Guy Sengstock and Jordan Hall and John Levesque.
Yeah.
But it's like,
yes, yeah.
I mean, and it needs to be articulated with a sense for the artistic, with the mysterious, with the intuitive, with the science, with the history of it. And there's so many facets to it. I mean, what do you feel like's coming up, or like how are you feeling about this psychedelic question right now?
I feel protective of the space. And I know that's a weird thing to say, because it's not my space, but I have been involved in, I've been involved in it since it was risky to be involved in it. And I feel like there are many people like that. I'm one of the younger people who's been involved in it from that, from the kind of mid 2000s kind of internet. I'm like the internet psychedelic generation, we were talking on like internet forums, and it was still super fringe. I had an article in The Guardian to promote my novel, which was in 2009, about the legalization of the use of psychedelics for spiritual practice, which is still not even an issue on the table, really, with the sciencey method. But like that article was like, there was so much hate in the comment section, people being like, I was like, made me fucking hate Guardian readers ever since, even though I am one. But and I remember being like, fuck, this is really quite fringe. And also like doing that article meant that like, I was just straight out of college looking for jobs. I was like, I could just not be hired if someone sees that. It ranks pretty high, like on the SEO.
100%. 100%. And
so
it's like, you're told by your friends, certainly in my case, because I wanted to go into the institutions, I had a respect for them. I have respect for, doing important stuff. And it's like, okay, how you can't reconcile those two things. You want to do a PhD, you want to go and do cutting edge stuff at a think tank, you want to be a leading scientist. You also had a transformational experience on, you had a heart opening experience on psilocybin that changed your whole life and was like has had all these effects. You just
can't bring that in.
Everything.
Now it's become like trendy. It's become sort of trendy now to like be into psychedelics, and like there's a huge amount of interest, and it's like everyone who has been involved with it for say 10 years or so, or 8 years, whatever, like has actually like really delved in. Like there's a process I think you go through of like real excitement to tempered, like, okay, they're not panaceas that are going to cure everything. There's a complexity here, to maybe to more hope, and like up and down. Like it goes into a real nuanced space. And so it's frustrating to see this sort of gold rush into like, oh, I'm going to go to Peru and do ayahuasca, and that's going to enlighten me, or this or that. And it's like, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to see because the stakes are very high. And a lot of the books, the fictional books that came out, or short stories that came out about psychedelic science in the late 60s and early 70s, and they're pretty obscure. I did them for my dissertation in university. They were, a lot of them, very fearful of corporate capture, and very fearful of people sort of making designer psychedelics, or using psychedelics to control. And like, and while I don't think they can really be used as well for controlling, CIA tried it with MK Ultra, and like they're non-specific amplifiers, so they amplify what, like, they're so complex. So it's like, it's pretty hard to brainwash someone with let's say, if brainwashing is even a thing, which is debatable. But that's a bit of a tangent. Like, I find it interesting that those were the anxieties then, and those anxieties are now coming back in people in the space. Like, everyone who's involved in either the activism or the science around it, a lot of the people I know, the conversations we're having all the time are based on anxiety of like, how do we protect this so that you don't get a situation where you have like McDonald's style psychedelic clinics popping up around the place, getting patients in and out, and basically subverting them into the existing paradigm.
Yeah, we froze a little bit.
I'm gonna have to.
I will cut that a little bit off.
No worries.
And just, wow, so many open boxes surrounding me right now. I'm just absolutely perplexed, and it feels like we'll just continue asking questions and exploring it endlessly. But thank you for coming on, and look forward to exploring it all further, and look forward to your next pieces.
Thanks, man.
Know that you have some steadfast fans of your medium out there, if you should get weary of writing.
Yeah, it's a lovely reminder. Thank you. I really appreciate like that. Yeah, I'm really happy that it's been useful and that people have responded well. And yeah, man, I'm really looking forward to seeing how SenseSpace develops as well. I'll be keeping an eye on it. So yeah, this is really great. Thanks for the discussion.